Please, everyone, let's welcome Dr. Clarence Wardell III to Entrepreneurship Hour.
Thank you. Hello, everyone hear me? Thanks for having me. Always good to be back in Ann Arbor. I see you guys are gearing up for spring. Nice, beautiful weather outside. Really happy to be here. I was asked to come speak on, I guess, the theme of, is it try, fail, risk, do? And so thinking a little bit about that theme and what I could say to you today that you might find remotely interesting. I immediately had this flashback to, this would be my junior year at Michigan. This is 2002. It feels like a couple years ago, but we're rolling up on a decade and a half here. And so I started to think about this guy, right? So marching band, as you could see, I joined a fraternity, was doing computer engineering here, still had some hair. And what I thought my life would look like at that point was a little bit like this. I thought my future would kind of be up and to the right? That I'd go on, get this degree from the world's best institution, get a job, wife, kids, continue in that job, maybe go to someplace else, but just kind of continue up that ladder in terms of what I would do. But in reality, and I'm sure I don't know, I think folks are all of different levels here, as I started to get into that second semester of junior year, I really started to give some thought to what does that future look like? And so this is what 2002 Clarence thought his life would look like, and this is what actually kind of ended up happening. And I'll tell you what the difference was between what I thought it was going to look like and actually what happened. And so as I entered junior year, or that second semester of junior year, I really started to think about for me at least, what did a career in computer engineering look like over the next few years? I joke with folks that I graduated computer engineering at probably one of the least interesting times in 2004. So this was post the first .com bubble, and then right before Facebook and all kind of your Web 2.0 companies really came into existence, right? So when I was here, we didn't have any of this, right? There wasn't conversations about going out and kind of starting your own thing. It was, you go to Microsoft. Google was still kind of a twinkle in people's eyes in some respect. And so as I thought about it, I didn't necessarily see myself just kind of behind a computer for the rest of my life. And then being on Michigan's campus, you may or may not know this, Michigan has a reputation for being a fairly politically active, politically charged campus. And I was involved in some of the conversations that were going on then. And for me, I always thought, what do I, as a computer engineer, what can I bring to these conversations, right? What is a life that's lived around kind of having impact in the public policy realm? How can I do that as an engineer? And so I started to take that second semester, I started to take some classes in econ. Game theory, a couple other economics classes that started to shift my thinking a little bit in terms of what I could contribute from a quantitative perspective to the public policy debate. And so as the end of junior year came around, you start to think about, what's happening after that senior year, And so I applied for a bunch of jobs, but I also applied for quite a few different graduate programs, some master's programs, PhD program and all types. I applied for, economics at the time. I think Berkeley had kind of what was a precursor to some of the data science programs with a master's in info econ. And ultimately got accepted to a PhD program in industrial systems engineering at Georgia Tech. And there, industrial systems engineering it covers the basis on a lot of things. If you were to get a PhD in statistics at Tech, you would do it in the industrial systems engineering department. Because of a few courses that I took towards the end of my time at Michigan, I got really interested, particularly in a concentration area they had there called economic decision analysis. So the science behind how decisions were being made, or how people make decisions. You may now know it maybe a little bit better as behavioral economics. And so got really interested in that space, but I saw this as an opportunity to start to move towards impact in the public policy arena. And so actually while I was there, I sought out one of my advisors was a behavioral economist in the public policy department. Ended up doing research that looked at competition among humanitarian relief organizations and then nonprofits more broadly to try to understand why do you see a competitive dynamic between supposedly altruistic organizations, right, and the science behind that. And then a layer of that then went on to trying to understand why people give, how do we give, and understanding the philanthropic and charitable giving space. So I spent 5 years at Tech, which for me really offered me an opportunity to pivot, like I said, a little bit away from kind of what I was doing in terms of computer engineering and start to explore some different places. So like anyone who's interested in the public policy realm, after my time at Tech, I journeyed to DC. It was a pretty exciting time. I had done some work, political work for the Obama campaign while I was in graduate school. And so this was early on in his time in office. And I got recruited by a public policy government think tank in DC called CNA Corporation. And so there was part of me that really wanted to work in the Obama administration, kind of out the gate. But I didn't really see an opportunity for someone with my skill set to participate. I thought that, that was really, that if you wanted to do that, you should have majored in political science, or you should have gone to law school, or maybe communications. And so I kind of put that on hold for a little bit, went to this think tank in DC where I worked on our safety and security team. Early on, worked a lot on disaster response, emergency management issues, as well as some law enforcement issues. This was also the same time that Twitter was kind of coming into its own in terms of people actually using the platform and figuring out what you could use it for. It's 2009, 2010. And so within the company, I started to try to mend some of my interests from the tech space, both in kind of social media, my background, from that computer engineering side, to some of these real world problems that we were seeing in the emergency management, disaster response space, and in the law enforcement space, quite frankly. And so how can we take and better use the data that's coming out of these technologies and tools to inform key decision makers in some of the public policy arenas? And then also, how can we better use these platforms to influence individuals, right? To help both the decision makers, but also communities make better decisions around these particular events. And so I'd always had, again, this bug of, how can we use the tech that's coming out of these great companies in Silicon Valley, in Ann Arbor, New York, Chicago, how can we use these tools to improve society? And so there wasn't really this culture of like kind of tech for social good or civic tech yet, but this notion I couldn't quite let it rest. And so while I was working at this company, I would come home in the evenings and spend another 5 to 6 hours probably started to tinker with this idea that I had to build on some of my graduate research. And as I said, Twitter was kind of just coming into form. This was back in the day when we thought it could be used for good. And so one of the ideas that I had was, this was pre-Stripe, some of your payment platforms that now make these things pretty simple, but the idea was, how could we leverage Twitter as a platform to connect people with the charities and causes that they care about and allow them to donate to these services in real time. And so created a company actually with a fellow alum from Michigan, Garland Gilchrist, who some of you may have met, basically running this platform. This was also alongside the work that I was doing at CNA. And so this was actually our main project. We ended up kind of having it be an incubator for several different products and tools. And so coming into the 2012 election, this was kind of the first time we started to hear about, this was maybe like the early fake news conversation, right? But this idea that there was just so much information coming at us between these new platforms and tools, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, is like, how do you discern what's true and what's not? And so we built this app. It was called Trivial Impact that allow you to go basically simulate a canvas, go door to door, answer questions, share with your friends. And this was also, I guess, in the heyday of Farmville as well. And so we were trying to build on top of that. And so I had essentially 2 jobs going, was working on these companies. We were starting to get a bit of momentum with TinyGive. And so I actually went down to part-time at my job and just kind of worked to do a little bit of consulting on the side, but effectively had left my job. I was in the process of taking a fellowship opportunity at Harvard to go there and to incubate these ideas. And about a week before, so I had packed up my stuff in DC, sent out an email to friends saying that we were going to have a going away party, that I was moving to Boston for a year. And about a week or two before that happened, I'd applied for a new program that the Obama administration had started called the Presidential Innovation Fellowship. I'd applied for that earlier in the year, hadn't really heard anything back, had an interview, just assumed that I didn't get it. And about a week or two before that, I got a call saying that they wanted me to join the fellowship. And so I had a decision to make at that point. It was, do I continue to do what I was going to do, go up to Boston, really kind of put all my chips on the table with Tiny Give and that company at the time, and hopefully kind of realize the impact that I wanted to see through that platform? Or do I take kind of this other once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go for work in an administration that I deeply cared about, and to hopefully have impact in another way? So I went back and forth on this, and I really didn't make the decision until the day before my going away party that I was going to stay in DC and do this fellowship. We ended up still having the going away party. As people were coming, I told them that I was actually staying, but wanted to have some drinks and food anyway. And so I went into the Obama administration as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and so that was in September of 2014. And so I only tell this, I kind of told that run-up, and I tell this story because I think, A, you saw those question marks there, those on that life path. The question marks were to represent, A, that kind of throughout this journey, I'm constantly kind of assessing, like, where can I have the most impact? What makes me happy? Where do I really thrive? But also, you're going to have these key decision points in your life, especially if you're pursuing a life or work where you're seeking to have impact and improve people's lives, on where you can do most effectively do that at. And so I had a pretty tough decision, at least for me at that point, to figure out, can I continue to work on this company and maybe have impact that way, or should I go into government, which is not a place that I ever thought I would necessarily be, to have impact on people's lives there. And so, I chose the latter, and I'll talk a little bit about like what that looked like, then some of the opportunities to have impact on people's lives from that perspective looked like, but also some of the entrepreneurship or ethos that you can infuse through platforms that aren't necessarily starting your own company, but through working at local levels of government and working on maybe some bigger platforms, if you will. And so I started as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, as I was saying, in September 2014. And so this was almost a month to the day after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And so I'm sure you all remember, if you think back a few years ago, kind of dominating the national conversation was this issue, right, of relations between police, law enforcement, and minority communities. And my work, I should say, my fellowship opportunity was, they asked, and the reason I almost said no, they asked me to come work at the National Nuclear Security Administration on tech transfer and commercialization policies, which, quite honestly, I didn't really have any background in, and it wasn't something that really interested me. But I talked to the fellowship director at the time, and he said, just get here. Once you get here, we recruited you all because you're entrepreneurs, because you're innovators. We know that you'll be able to find some other projects and things that can make an impact and that are more suited to your skill set, if you will. And that happened a little bit quicker than I anticipated. And so I found myself as a technologist, innovator, entrepreneur, whatever you want to call it, working in the administration at a time where they were dealing with problems that, I had some knowledge about from the work that I had done previously at CNA, but also something that I deeply cared about as a black man in America. And to be able to work from that vantage point to hopefully affect some change. And so I don't know if folks remember, but that fall there was a conversation about what could we do about some of these issues, right? So the president convened his task force on 21st century policing, and the task force eventually, there were 59 recommendations that came out of that report, 14 of which actually had to do with the better use of data and technology to improve police-citizen relations. And so that was pretty timely. And so this conversation of not just the lack of officer-involved shooting data, but if you look at communities around the country, we just don't have really good data, period, on what do interactions between police and citizens look like. So it's officer-involved shooting data, use of force, assaults on officers, traffic and pedestrian citations issued, anything where police and communities are coming into contact. And so prior to that time, it was part of the reason you didn't see that was just no one was having that conversation. It just wasn't top of mind. But just police departments were fairly reticent, by and large, to release some of that information. And so what we did, we had an opportunity at that point because of what the national conversation was, not because we had any type of legal power over departments. If you're familiar with the system, there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country that are all essentially independent jurisdictions, right? So there's some federal oversight, but not much. And so it's really up to those communities and those jurisdictions to kind of act as they will. But what we did is we had an opportunity in a platform to uplift the organizations and entities that were doing this work well, to pair those folks with technologists, so engineers, designers, product managers, university researchers, and show what could the future of policing and transparency look like. And so myself and a colleague basically pitched this idea inside the White House. We got some quizzical looks at first, but we got a few folks there to buy in. I don't know if folks know, but the Obama administration had the first U.S. Chief Technology Officer. There were 3 in the administration. Because of where we were situated, we actually kind of had a decent amount of interaction with Megan Smith, who was the CTO when I was there, and she listened to our idea, brought it to some of the policy folks. And we did this convening to kind of kick this off. We looked around the country and we saw departments who were actually doing this work really well. So Dallas Police Department with Chief Brown, if you look down in Austin, Texas, Montgomery County, Maryland, Louisville, Kentucky. And so we brought those folks and those chiefs to the White House. We brought, right there is DJ Patel, who was the US Chief Data Scientist, the first one that we've ever had. And so we brought a group of data scientists, so folks from University of Chicago's Data Science for Social Good, Code for America, Bayes Impact, some other names you might be familiar with. Brought researchers from various universities across the country. We basically spent a day together trying to understand, what could we get the departments to commit to, and how could we help them both design better tools and technology to release this data. And so from that point, we got commitments from, and that's our commitment board there, we got commitments from the departments to said that we will pledge to basically release at least 3 data sets around police-citizen interactions. And so we got enough momentum up front that we actually got the president to announce this thing that we called the Police Data Initiative initially. And so we went from, in the span of essentially a year and a half, from a handful of police departments around the country releasing this type of data by the time I left the administration, we had on the order of 130 law enforcement agencies across the country committed to this. City of Detroit is one, departments from the size of New York Police Department all the way down to Burlington, Vermont, and some really small, or Rutland, Vermont actually, some really small police departments who are committed to release this data. We had over 300 data sets released in an open data format, so machine readable, disaggregated demographic levels. And so we were able to affect this change in a way that would not have been possible outside of government, right? For me, and I think about this frequently, I think about platforms a lot and where you're able to do your work and where you're able to have maximum impact. I certainly would have had the same thoughts as Clarence sitting outside of government, but because I had showed up, because I was there, and because we were actually given a space and an opportunity to propose ideas, to be entrepreneurial in this space, we were able to launch an initiative that exists to this day. It's run by some external entities with funding in departments who are still releasing data. And it wasn't just about the data. We used data as a convener to have conversations in the communities that we were involved with. So after that, I was asked to, after the Innovation Fellowship, I was actually asked to join. This was another initiative. I don't know if folks are familiar with the U.S. Digital Service. So this was kind of another startup within the White House that was launched out of the healthcare.gov initial catastrophe. And so as part of that, trying to rally from that, the president basically called on a few folks from Silicon Valley. So you had some Google site reliability engineers, a couple folks from Amazon, and some few healthcare companies that came in, and they were kind of the success story behind getting healthcare.gov back on track. And so after the president saw the success of that, he said, I I need more you folks in government, because we have a bunch of problems like this. We have a bunch of citizen-facing services that folks need help with, right? So the Department of Veteran Affairs, right? You guys have seen probably the Daily Show, or you've heard certainly about the backlog, right, where we have veterans coming home from war that can't get their health care, right, or they're put on 3-year waiting lists to go get mental health or counseling and services. And so, or if you talk about, people being able to apply for immigration status, right, and to see what does a smooth process look like for that. These are major issues that affect large swaths of the country, but for so long, like folks like us haven't been showing up because we thought we could do, work outside of government to affect people's lives, which is true. But when you think about, you may be a small cog in a big machine there. When you think about the impact on people's lives there, it's orders of magnitude what I was able to do, for instance, with TinyGive, which is why I don't regret that decision at all. So I joined the U.S. Digital Service, and I'll kind of wrap up with like a little bit on what I did there. Do folks know these faces? All right, they were in the news probably beginning of last year, right? So FBI Director Comey over there and Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates there. And so I would just say, I have these two on the screen because it was kind of surreal for me. It's actually my time in the U.S. Digital Service started working on projects for both of these folks. And so I started at the beginning of my time in the U.S. Digital Service, spent 2 months out in West Virginia working with the FBI NICS system. So this is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And so this is the system that people have to, when they go purchase a firearm in this country, that's the system that does the background checks, right? It's a very antiquated system. It relies a lot on like people actually entering a lot of this data, which leads to errors, which sometimes leads to people getting guns that aren't supposed to have them. And so we had a team that was out there working on that system to improve it such that we have better data in the system and we have a more reliable system. At the end of that project, I had to go brief Director Comey on our work and make recommendations. He's a very tall dude. Like at least 6'8", and you can see it there. Very nice guy too, though. And then the end of my time at USDS, I actually was working with the Bureau of Prisons and Department of Justice on reducing recidivism and reentry and improving reentry outcomes for folks who are going through the federal prison system. And so this was a project of Deputy Attorney General Yates, and so we had bi-weekly meetings with her on this project. So. This is not, when you go back to 2002, Clarence, this is not ever where I thought I'd be working as a guy with computer engineering, industrial systems engineering degree, working with some of the folks in the highest levels of governments making decisions around public policy problems. And so that's my background, but it's also kind of my pitch on thinking a little bit more about where you can have impact and where you can be entrepreneurial, both within government. And so, I'll just wrap up a little bit on like what some of my work looks like now. After November 2016, I had kind of a soul-searching moment. I knew I wasn't staying in administration personally, and I wanted to, again, kind of seeking out where can I go to have impact on people's lives, to improve the services that they're getting from their government. And at that point, I thought that local level was going to be a lot of where the decision making and the direct impact on people's lives were. And so I joined what's called the What Works Cities Initiative, which is an effort launched through the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, his foundation. And it's an effort to work with 100 mid-sized cities to improve their capacity to better use data and evidence for policy making and decision making. And so in March of last year, I joined as the director of Repurpose for Results, working alongside folks like it's actually to the right there is Mayor Nutter, who's a former mayor of Philadelphia. So we work together working with smaller cities around the country to build their capacity to not only use data, but to make decisions and some of the harder decisions that you might have to make when the data and evidence kind of show you that that's the right decision to make. So, as a Michigan alum, not a big fan of Notre Dame, but the mayor there, so this is South Bend, Indiana, the mayor there, Pete Buttigieg, is I think one of the more progressive mayors in the country when it comes to the use of data and evidence for running his city. So him doing some work with Tulsa, Oklahoma, San Jose, California, and a few other cities, again, around how do we better leverage tech, data, evidence, and then also people to make decisions that improve residents' lives. So that's kind of my story from the time I left Michigan till now. Happy to answer some questions around that. I just want to wrap up with like a few lessons that I as I was reflecting and putting together this talk that I think I pulled out of this, out of that time. And so it's a few quick ones. Use your network. You're graduating from one of the best and largest universities in the world. The thing that I didn't realize when I was applying to Michigan and when I thought about like how much pride I took in my Michigan degree was the network on the other side. And that's actually been probably one of the biggest assets that I can say. As you all know, as you move throughout the country, there's huge communities of alum in pretty much any city. And so those are the folks who you're going to rely on, when you're trying to get your company up and off the ground, who can make introductions for you. Or it's probably honestly some of the peers in your room. There will be some of the first co-founders on whatever venture that you're working on. And so as I said before, Tiny Give, when I had the idea, the first person I reached out to was Garland, who used to be my lab mate in I think it was the EECS 370. And it was him who I didn't have any money to give him. We had equity in a company that was worth nothing. And it was like, hey, you want to come work on this idea? He showed up and was able to pull in resources from other folks who I met here to do some of the early design work and prototyping and what have you. And so I think, my network, your network, that will be one of the most valuable things that you can carry throughout your time. One of the other things I look back and think about is I sometimes wonder, as I was doing, I was working a full-time job and then coming home in the evening to work on this company. I didn't have any money, real money other than what I was making at that job to put into the company, and just had time. And I always wondered, when you're talking about this kind of risk piece, right, especially as an entrepreneur, people will kind of give you crap at times and say, unless you're all in, it's never going to work. And I think maybe sometimes that's true, but I also think it's okay to make calculated risks sometimes. I wasn't leaving my job, I still needed a paycheck, and I still needed some type of comfort level there to be able to work on this. And so, just said to say that every risk doesn't need to be put all your chips in the middle of the table. Sometimes it's okay to hold a few back. The other piece I was talking about is entrepreneurship as a mindset. It's not always just starting your own company, right? But it's finding spaces within what looks like, legacy, archaic institutions to be entrepreneurial, to start new things, to start new ventures, to make impact. That's what the Presidential Innovation Fellowship was about. We were talking earlier, at the local level, there's lots of these initiatives that are started within communities and cities where you have a chance to go in, create something new. And the good thing about that is actually we were running a project within government that, a new project, something that I would have had to fundraise for on the outside, but I had a salary and I had the resources of the federal government to make this thing work. And this brings me to my other piece of platforms are important. It's important to think about the type of impact that you want to have and potentially where you can best have that impact. And so as I said before, just me as Clarence starting the company wasn't going to be able to do what we ultimately did with something like the Police Data Initiative, right? It was the platform of the White House at that point in time to be able to do that work. And I'd say the same is again, as you go throughout your career, think about not just, what is the salary or the benefits at the job and what the work is that you're doing, but also what the platform is and how you can best use that to accelerate your work. Other piece I would say, and I'm sure everyone in this room is doing this, but keep working on side projects. I know for a fact that it was not my day job that got me the offer to be a Presidential Innovation Fellow. It was the fact that folks saw that I had built and sustained something outside of my day job that they were impressed with, that got me the fellowship and then eventually led to some of these other things. And so it's not always the case that you can find a job on the thing that you're really excited about. So keep working on the thing that you're excited about until you can make that happen. One of the other things that's I guess my career has been a little bit of, and Megan Smith, I would say was the US CTO, she says this a lot. She says sometimes in your career, you want to go where you are rare. And I put sometimes because I think you want to do both. And we were having this conversation before, sure, graduate, go work at the new company in Silicon Valley, get those skills, figure out how to be a world-class product manager, right? Figure out how to be the best data scientist you can. But sometimes the best impact you can have is when you take those skills and you go to a place that hasn't seen them before, right? And you can be kind of that kind of at the forefront of creating some really massive change, right? And it's also where you can get ideas that you would have never thought of before by working alongside people that you don't get a chance to interact with on a day-to-day basis. This for me is okay to create the template. And so for me, this is largely meant, when you're in DC, if you go out to any event in DC, people often ask you, like, so the first question out of their mouth is like, sometimes not even your name, it's like, what do you do? You know, which used to be the question that I hated the most because I could never explain like all of that, right? It's taking me, what, like 30, 40 minutes right now? I could never explain all of that in like kind of a short soundbite. And I always used to be a little frustrated, like when I looked at like my friends who went to like law school or medical school, right? Like the template for them, and they may push back on this, right? But the template is fairly clear, or that path is clear, right? You know, you go to law school, you know if you want to be a lawyer, what a good firm job looks like, that you have to pass the bar. Same for med school. You go to med school, do your boards, residency, get a job, you go up that ladder. And so that career path is kind of defined. And I used to be a little jealous of that, of like knowing what the next step should be. This will feel uncomfortable sometimes, you know, as an entrepreneur, as you're trying to blaze your own trail, but it's okay. You know, some people will be skeptical of it, but just be confident in who you are. Last piece here, this is like young Michigan Clarence, even younger than 2002. And I put this up, it's just, I was thinking about, as I was putting this together, this also happened to kind of coincide. My mom passed away 4 years ago on February 27th. And one of the biggest lessons that she left with me, and I think has been like animated my career, is, you know, and this is not new, but it's just something that I constantly think about, is like, particularly right now, when you see something that upsets you in the world, or you see an injustice, or you see, you know, a place where you can make a difference, just roll up your sleeves and get involved. And so for me, that's been kind of what I've sought throughout my career. Sometimes been successful, sometimes I'm not. You know, there's a lot of, there's certainly I guess I kind of created like a clean arc, but there's a lot of failures in there too. A lot of times I was told no. Actually, the first time I applied for the fellowship, I didn't get the fellowship, which is why I didn't think I got it the second year either. But you know, just kind of keep pushing forward on like where you can think you can have the most impact. So with that, thank you. Hopefully left a little bit of time for some Q&A.
All right. Thanks.